Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our new series, Integral Teens Love Anal. I'm Layman Pascal, and today we're exploring the links between exhibitionist sodomy, occult rituals, and the secret alien bloodline of Jesus. No, hold on, I'm reading the wrong notes. Today we are doing something that might be just as ridiculous and upsetting, though. Something we call the Fantastic Four Quad Rants, and or the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Either way, Dr. Doom is going to be taken seriously today. Brent Cooper, Bruce Alderman, Edward Berge, and myself will be complaining about the insufficiency of integral formulations, feeling towards synthesizing overlaps between meta-discourse communities, and lamenting the inadequate protocols that are not fully leveraging the potential for a meta-progressive, post-pluralistic, and actively convergent real-world response to things like the meta-crisis, the ongoing plight of the climate, the engineered precariosity of the working class, the anti-fragile egalitarian needs of a world teetering on collapse, and the urgent impulse to extend personal metanoia into the political realm. We'll each, I think, say hello and maybe why we're here. And then I've proposed that we go around and hear what each of us has top of mind in terms of what's frustrating us and what feels needed across the so-called quadrants. And then we'll double back and start responding to each other and finding places of convergence. I like all these guys, despite their divergent temperaments, and I think we all share a sense that these are urgent times, that the reigning modern customs need to be more seriously and comprehensively critiqued, and that anyone with any pretensions to being a higher, deeper, more complex thinker has got to start showing up with moral force around crucial basic issues that affect everyone, regardless of what values and worldviews we purport to hold. So first up, in the red corner, weighing in at whatever he weighs, the Sultan of Snark, the monster of metamodernism, the untethered alpine sociologist, Brent Cooper.
I was wondering who you were going to hand it to with that title.
Yeah, that could be any of us.
Titles, yeah. I'll take it though. Well, I guess off the top, I consider myself working class. It's also obviously a kind of obsolescent category, if you will. Right? It means too many different things to too many different people these days, but just generally speaking, right, it's kind of reducible to the 99% versus the 1%, the wealth holders versus the workers of various capacities and sorts. And of course, what we want to do is crack the age-old kind of perennial paradox of class consciousness. And that means, unpacking what that means and also updating it for the 21st century.
All right. How about you, Edward?
Why am I here? I am in this quadrantic expression because I too come from the working class, and I am really curious to see how our integral / metamodern meta theories can be translated down into effective policy to help the working class. I question whether us just providing those models to the working class will have any effect. So how do we translate the principles that we promote in our meta theories into language that the working class understands and which will motivate them to voting and political behavior?
Bruce?
Why am I here? Because Edward invited me and it sounded really cool. I'm also considering myself working class. When I get criticisms occasionally online, in different forums, it's often for being an academic, an elitist or an academic. And it's always humorous to me since the academic part of my life is actually a very small corner of it. It's what I'm known by online, but it's a latecomer in my life and it's a very minimal part of my income. And so my roots, my feeling is in basically, the working class in terms of what I've done all my life in so many different fields. I don't often put myself in the place to speak from either white collar, blue collar. I don't typically organize the world in that way. But if I have to think about where I sit, I really sit pretty much in middle class and lower middle class. And that's what I've inhabited most of my life. And I'm happy to speak to the concerns for that group because I think the viability of the middle class is rapidly shrinking. And what I'm feeling lately is even the little bubbles of luxury that I've been able to afford myself to do thinking and to do self-development and to try to step out of the confines that I've inhabited growing up from a broken home and like that. I can feel how precarious they are and how easily that can be dissolved and thrust back just into games of survival. So what can we do, I think, to promote thriving for the greatest span is I think a very worthy exercise. And I'm looking forward to exploring that with all of you.
I'm really intrigued by two different, I think, complementary aspects of the relationship between higher theory and the working class. And so one is, how does the theory itself make inroads into the needs and structures? How does it better describe and propose transformation? But the other one is, how does it become more comprehensible and assimilable to people that do not have the time, energy, and inclination for theory work? Right. And that's an old question. It's a question Orwell dealt with. It's a question Marx dealt with. And it's not like those guys had all the answers, but they were confronting the question of how leading edge critical thought and transformation can make alliances with the people who are actually doing the work and actually producing the value in our society, because very often those groups don't have a lot in common temperamentally and socially, and it's very hard to get them on the same page in a way where they enrich each other.
Well, I'll respond to that just to say that, we can theorize all day, and of course there's a question of the quality of education, but what it boils down to in the most actionable policy sense is making education universal, removing all the taboos culturally and politically about allowing people to be literate and divorcing education from work to some extent, and promoting community activities. So essentially, making the decisions in advance to fund these things and not let them be undercut by the detractors, so to speak. So if, it's not enough that, a bunch of people go and get advanced degrees and then become activists and try to spread the gospel. To actually transform society, the mechanisms need to be sort of already in place that support and scaffold people up educationally, right? So we have an epistemic crisis, not because of lack of information out there and the internet and whatnot, but because by and large people are separated from the self-learning process and from the institutional tools to do it. So so in a policy sense, what needs to happen? You need to abolish student debt. You need to make education free, essentially, and accessible. And these are the biggest levers of a kind of working class shift, for lack of a better word.
There's a lot of ways to critique the education system. Obviously, its content and the way it provides information is insufficient for people to really assimilate and understand it. There are also problems with the metrics we use to gauge whether we've provided people with education. But clearly, at especially the post-secondary level, we've got a huge economic incentive problem, which has caused some countries, especially the United States, to not really be supporting people at gaining that level of education in whatever form they're going to gain it. So I'm wondering if we can just check in here, or do we all generally feel that that state provided free access to higher education is sort of a universal right that ought to be enshrined culturally at this time?
I also support that. One thing that stands out strongly in my mind is when I was living in the desert Southwest, I'd put off going to college. Actually, I dropped out of college, and I was living near Sedona, which is a popular tourist place, and I met a German man who came to look around the Red Rocks and do the hiking, and I ended up becoming a tour guide for him for a few days. And when he found out that I'd dropped out of college and that financial barriers kept me from being there, he was just shocked. It was unimaginable for him to have no access to higher education. And he just thought, how can America be so-called a leading first world country and not provide that? So that's what he said to me when I was, still young and beginning to form political opinions. And but that has stuck with me. And I later was inspired by Krishnamurti, who basically felt that we don't need to focus on kind of exclusive monastic kind of environments only to train, higher level contemplative people. We need, if we really want transformation in society, we need to start from pre-K, from kindergarten, and work with people growing up so that people can grow up with maximum integrity, maximum self-authenticity, maximum insight into social forces and conditioning, and psychological awareness and psychospiritual awareness. And so that's a mission I believed in from early on. The way it's manifested for the Krishnamurti Foundation, there's not enough interest, and there's small schools and they still cost money to go there. But I think the model that they began to develop there, and of course there's other model communities that would be wonderful to look at and learn from. I think we need more experiments like that, and it would be ideal to have that recognized as a basic right for individuals to have the kind of education that's going to prepare them even to participate meaningfully in the kind of high-level complex society that we're co-creating.
There's a time scale anxiety that comes up for me, which is, reform of the educational systems, both in terms of their content and layout and also their financial structure. That's kind of a mid-range solution. And people are going bankrupt with medical bills right now. They are suffering massive metabolic diseases right now. And we're looking at massive ecological disruption and therefore massive social disruption coming on extremely fast, far faster probably than we could do a really nice reform of the general education system. So, how do we all think about, the rate at which we can do these things and how we triage our priorities to address what's going to hit us the fastest?
Well, one of the priorities is we're talking about higher education and its availability. That's one thing. But right now, in the US at least, many people graduating from college can't find jobs. And their degree is pretty much useless in that sense. So they're having to take, basic minimum wage jobs, or 2 or 3 of them, just to get by. So we have to make a college degree meaningful again so that there's actually a place to work. Bruce can attest to this, getting his advanced degree and having a hell of a time getting a job, in the university system, and one that, pays you well enough. It's on a tenure track. I mean, tenure track is almost impossible nowadays. And most people like Bruce are adjuncts. And, that fulfills, as Bruce said, part of his, need to teach, but you also need to be rewarded in a way that provides for your basic needs. And that's just not happening anymore. So part of the educational dilemma is having a job when you get done. Also, going back to education in the first place, public education, that was the goal of it, originally designed to offer free public education up to grade 12 for everyone, to make them better citizens. And part of my education growing up in grade school was civics class. We don't have that anymore. Civics class, at least made us aware that there's other people and there's a society, and how do we fit into that? And, it teaches you about the political system and representative government and all that, which gives you an idea of how to participate. But these things are gone from our, public education system. So that also needs a revamping.
When I suggest something like this, like universal education, like this is just one of many baselines. So I'm glad we're all in agreement too, because the way I approach some of these topics is that it's beyond debate. We can get into the nuance of it ourselves, but if we can't agree on baselines and establish functional baselines, then it's all hopeless. And so, of course, solving the education crisis in itself does not solve the meta crisis, and a lot of these problems are baked in because we didn't, as a civilization, choose the more generative paths, right? Which would include universal healthcare, a jobs guarantee, all facets of this in anticipation of what's unfolding. And so, coming back to the working class concept, like it needs to be the broadest concept possible that in some sense transcends wealth as well. So if I was rich, that my politics would be the same, right? Because I'm advocating for other people, not myself. So and the concept of work itself, right, needs to be broken down. Like, technically I'm unemployed, but I'm still working class and I still work hard in various ways. And intellectual labor that is actually worthwhile, a lot of it is demonetized and decommodified, right? We produce this knowledge freely, and it's also disruptive to the system. So, a lot of it boils down to, especially to get to your question, Layman, like how we deal with the triage. It's converging these issues and solutions, and realizing the historical forks that kind of bifurcations and breaking points that took a wrong direction, right? And a lot of that can be explained through kind of analyzing technocracy and bureaucracy, how decisions are made, sometimes in a very strategic sense, like, oh, let's protect American interests. Think about it in the context of the big picture. That's a dead end. That's a very brain dead way of thinking. And, just to connect it with something topical, right, the Afghanistan war. We don't even need to get into any of the details, just to say it's a disaster. It was built on lies. And, things like this, the military industrial complex, for the most part, these things could not be further divorced from the actual concerns for kind of moral and civilizational progress.
Bruce, how do you think about these baselines that Brent's discussing and the order in which you feel like it's most important to address them?
I think I'd like to take a little step back before we progress too far in this discussion. And I'm saying that by way of answering your question too, and that part of the theme for this talk today is the Fantastic Four. And I want to kind of playfully touch on some of those themes in framing what we're doing here. my present mood in approaching this discussion, especially after digesting some other things this week online, is I don't have a great deal of hope politically for us to make the kind of changes that we need to make to address these, address the social problems we have and the economic problems we have before the little disruptions that we're all experiencing now cascade massively, and we won't even be dealing with the same kind of system that we have right now. I think there can be, within 10 to 20 years, a lot of people are suggesting that we could be facing massive institutional failure. And so what is our priority then? If within our lifetimes we may experience massive death, massive resource shortage, cascading ecological disasters, so many things that could be happening at once and coming soon. What do we do? What are our priorities then if we can't assume that in the next 80 years, which, that's the kind of window we really need if we're talking about revising an education system and then and extending it all and then growing up a populace that's suited for the kind of context we have. Right now, my feeling is more one of Dr. Doom looming over us, and I'm not sure that's the world we're facing anymore. And then what is our priority? What do we really focus on at a grassroots level, at an individual level, across communities to meet the future as it's approaching us in an adequate way? If I was to, choose to be one of the Fantastic Four, I was thinking I would be Invisible Woman, because I'm always talking about prepositions, and prepositions often work subtly and unobtrusively, hiddenly in the background to foster different kinds of relations, and they serve as angelic mediators, witchy mesh weavers and midwives. And I think we need to be doing that. We need to be building connections among communities that bypass the current institutional structures, because I don't know that they're going to be there. I'd like to say that we need to do both at the same time. Don't give up fighting for policy. Don't give up, political activism. But at the same time, if we put all of our eggs in that basket, I'm afraid all those eggs might be broken.
I agree. It's a multi-pronged approach. Requires something from all quadrants, all levels, all lines. And that's part of the theme of, I think, metamodernism is how do we somehow coordinate all of these different angles of approach to solving the problem. And one of the reasons I chose the Human Torch as my Fantastic Four icon is because my preferred mode of affecting change is the political, and promoting the kinds of policies that lift up the working class. So framing has been one of my key roads to doing that. And using the Human Torch as my model, I consider myself the Human Scorch. Because part of the framing process is to inflame our deepest emotions to motivate us to action. I had posted something in our little email group about inflaming ourselves with prayer. That was an injunction from my previous life in theurgy, in Hermetic Kabbalah. It was an injunction famous by Aleister Crowley that you need to invoke often, and you need to inflame yourself with prayer. You need to, get into the emotional feeling of what it is you're trying to accomplish. And I related that to, the modern cognitive linguistics of Lakoff and crew, saying pretty much the same thing from that perspective, that just providing abstract reasoning works for us eggheads, but it doesn't motivate the masses. In fact, it turns them off. They see us as an elite that are lost in this world of abstraction and social engineering. I think that's a large part of why Trump won in the first place, is, this revolt against the elite. So cognitive framing has to be simple. It has to be direct. It's got to reach us emotionally to motivate us to do something. And part of that is doing it from a higher perspective, meaning love and compassion and those values. But the other part of it is engaging in the trench warfare of down and dirty, name calling, et cetera, et cetera. The right is excellent at this. Trump was excellent at it. And you can see how much and how many that motivated. Well, this can be also engaged from the progressive side with the holistic goals in mind of helping people love and be compassionate toward each other. But at the same time, when you're dealing with a fascist upsurge as represented by the modern Republican Party, they need to be confronted also with trench warfare. And that's why I call myself the human scourge, because part of my framing is ridiculing them, name calling them. And usually the name, it's not just name calling, it's accurate name calling. To recall them Republicans is an accurate statement of how repugnant they are and what they're doing. So for me, framing, engaging both aspects, the positive and the negative, are effective and necessary if we ever want to defeat these forces. Because if we don't, democracy is literally at stake.
Two things are coming up for me. The first sort of plays off what Bruce was saying about, is the world we're going to be, is the arena of our action in the next little while even going to be the same one that we've been in? I think what we need in many respects is to have pieces on the table that could be adapted to circumstances as they change, right? I've got some serious doubts about the Biden administration, but I love that the idea of a green core is involved in some of these proposals. It's something I've been passionate about for a long time, something that can combine, a jobs guarantee and a UBI and an ecological movement and some kind of security for the working class in a way that's adaptive to the world as it changes. If you could have some kind of ecologically oriented basic job that can be modified as we go forward, then we're in a much better position. And I think one of the problems with liberal modernist market economies is they're not very anticipatory. They don't prepare us for things that are not currently impinging on the market. And we have to have tools in place so that as the system changes, we'll be able to implement solutions that might be good for a lot of people. So that's on the one side. And I think people like Bernie have thought that way for a long time, right? Instead of introducing an Obamacare, we've already got Medicare. You've got that piece on the table, then you can expand it, modify it, do new things with it. So I think it's important for us to have all of our options and all of our tools on the table politically. And when it comes to what Edward was saying, there's this really interesting phenomenon of what do we do around the pseudo-conservative working class and the people who putatively speak for them, right? And there's, on the one hand, there's this false liberal denigration of these people that does not appreciate their humanity or their working class situation or any of their real emotions, anything that they have at stake. But on the other hand, there's this idea that they've assimilated a false consciousness where they don't actually think of and feel toward the thing that would benefit themselves. They think of and feel towards something that would benefit economic super predators in the system. So in terms of making contact with half of the working class, we have to be able to roll out critique of false consciousness in a way that doesn't sound weird or crazy or radical or too abstract. And we also have to do what Edward was talking about, which is be able to mythically inflame people to have some kind of enthusiasm for political transformation, because there's lots of reasons why, just looking at our history, that it's implausible that we will make positive changes. But that hinges upon whether enough people are passionately invoked to try, right? And there is some kind of crucial threshold where enough people, passionate enough, mythically informed enough, flamed on enough, could get that ball to the end zone with only a small opening in the oppositional team. So I think both of those, in my mind, are things we need to do in terms of thinking about this whole other half of the working class, who's very often just dismissed as crazy fascist radicals.
Well, one quick comment about that. That's what I was saying. The attack dog stance is from the point of view of compassionate care and love for those workers, however they identify. So it's the leaders of the Republican Party that I'm attacking, not the workers. In fact, the kinds of policies, progressive policies that are suggested for Bernie, AOC, and the Squad, the Progressive Caucus, are designed to help all working class people so that they can earn a living wage, have security in their job, get benefits, get medical care. And the hope is that by providing those basic needs and through education and training, then people can so-called move up Maslow's scale of hierarchy of needs, so that then we can reasonably talk about getting them to pursue some of the things that we have the privilege of doing, like self-actualization. So when I talk about trench warfare, I'm talking about the party itself, not the people.
I want to go to Brent here, but I want to quickly address something about that, because I think it is important to make that distinction, that the aggression, the trench warfare, is directed at the false representatives of those people and not at those people. But I also think there's another part to that, which is a lot of those people appreciate aggression, appreciate combat, right? They're very concerned about borders. They lean into wars more than other people. So those aren't necessarily great things, but they're people who are looking for an aggressive stance in their representation, which they often don't get from some of the people who have the better ideas about how to upgrade our system. So, Brent, what were you going to say there?
I think it was to do with just false consciousness, which you mentioned, Layman. And there's a lot of false consciousness. I think it's, obviously that's in part a socially constructed abstraction. It's very difficult to kind of represent that in a nutshell. But, pointing to Republicans or Democrats, like it's all low hanging fruit. They've all got false consciousness, which is to say we're all kind of captured by the narratives, the capitalist foundation of a lot of the discourse has captured almost everybody, right? So it relates to this crisis of truth and authority as well. And, for me, like looking to build up points of intervention, right? And also, with all the fetishization of localism, there's not enough there's not enough like effective critique within our communities, right? So you alluded earlier to the meta mission here, the convergent, goals and methods of different long-term thinking communities. But, you know, there's a constant failure in real time to litigate and intervene on the discourse itself. What are we talking about? How is it framed? Right. So, you know, in the United States, where a lot of the problems emanate from, you know, the pundits, different politicians continue to get it wrong, you know, get issues of race and class and everything wrong. And, you know, a lot of this is not new. I remember, like, maybe it was the early 2000s. I think Lou Dobbs on CNN, and right, you know, CNN is not good. Neither is Lou Dobbs particularly, but there was a kind of a series on the disappearance of the middle class, right? And then that kind of discourse like faded into the background, right? But it never ceased to be a crisis. The problem actually only intensified. And then we have a kind of revival of this lamenting of the disappearance of the middle class. Like, well, what did you expect, right? And so we don't have to give credit to CNN here for having the foresight or covering a relevant topic at the time, because that was also just part of their machine, their agenda, you know, to sell commercials or whatever in the given moment, right? It's a kind of feigned interest in fostering consciousness, but in effect, what all these mainstream media institutions are just doing is building manufacturing consent. And so, you know, when I wanted to come back home to our different overlapping communities, our four-way discussion as well, even though we mostly align, you know, I've been surprised, but also, you know, validated at how weak the intellectual efforts of some of these top sense makers or meta thinkers or whatever have been. Because so I wanted to close this thought out, speaking to Edward's point though about sort of attack and critique, because back in 2016 I was attacking you know, the Hillary Clinton types just as much, right? Kind of saying, hey, like, you're not going to get Hillary Clinton. Like, if you keep pushing this narrative, you know, it's a coin toss. You know, Trump's very popular. The state of Republican voters and leaders are working together. You know, they're consonant, even if they're not. There's no consilience among it. It's a completely just abusive, deranged, false consciousness. But just the inability to table the Bernie Sanders agenda in some of these discourses, even when it's making historical breakthroughs and breaking the mainstream narrative, and a literal kind of, albeit slow but very real, revolution in political consciousness is happening, right? So we need to honestly look at how that's routinely suppressed by our colleagues, right? Because if, you know, I hate Bush in this expression, but like, if you're not with us, you're against us. And when it comes to solidarity and building real collective consciousness, I think that's very true, because we need to, you know, coordinate our thought, our actions, and our political agency. So, you know, why this isn't being accelerated and fostered to keep up with the meta crisis constantly eludes me.
There's some interesting anxieties around identity that come up for me in thinking about that. You know, there a lot of people understand this anxiety around identity when it comes to identifying yourself in a class. And I think one of the problems in North America is that people have been very reluctant to accept that they have a class identity. You know, I grew up in a farming and fishing village. We didn't have a lot and we did everything by hand, but we maintained the veneer of a lower middle class society. We were very educated, but we also had a kind of an estate. So you also feel this old fashioned aristocratic sensibility. And so for me, it was very hard to identify myself with any particular socioeconomic segment of the population. But I think part of that is not just that it's difficult, it's that we very often don't want to, right? People don't want to say, you know what, I am poor, or I am in the working class. All right, I'm not really going to turn out to be one of the millionaires that 1980s movies proposed was waiting for all of us. So there's an anxiety there in terms of making that identification. There's also a parallel anxiety in these long-range meta-discourse communities around taking a side on anything, because we're all so good at least nominally balancing out positions and integrating multiple perspectives and not being the gross people who get caught in one of the sides, right? And so we share that, and it naturally forms part of the attractor of how we all come together. And it means, though, that we are reticent more than we need to be about taking an actual side, or even about acknowledging that politics is an important thing to discuss. It makes us anxious, and we've got to be able to accept that fact so that we can move past it.
Well, in that regard, I'd like to bring up your essay, Layman, about metapolitics. And you noted it comes at it from two sides. One was the meta-modern communities promoting a new vision. And the other side of it was exactly what you just said, getting into the nitty-gritty of the politics and where do we intervene in the political system in order to enact our high ideals. And as I said, my chosen path was the latter, getting involved in translating down the high ideals into where we are as a society right now in their own terms, so that we can reach them, communicate with them, have some impact. And to me right now, that the leading edge of that is the progressive movement in our US political system. Bernie Sanders being a prime example. So I'm kind of curious how each of you see the grand ideals we are exploring in our meta-modern and integral theories and worldviews. How do we translate that into getting involved in the political enactment of specific policies like Medicare for All, the Green New Deal, things that are prerequisite to any advanced vision of where we're going? How do we get involved and on that level in the terms necessary to have an effect? I question whether this whole notion of integral in the beginning was, well, let's just reach the business leaders and give them this model. But did that really have much of an effect? Did it really elevate the working class, or did it just impose yet another social engineering project that workers resented? So that's my question. How do we get this grand vision of ours? How do we get it into effective policy?
Yeah, I wanna pick up off that and Layman's point about taking sides. I think it's imperative and it's incumbent on us to take a side in order to break the sides, right? If we want to transcend the political impasse, we need to stop pretending that there's an equivalence between the different political movements and teams. I've been lamenting and criticizing this tendency for years, and again, I think it's something that is validated. But just to say it again, there's no both sides. Anybody says both sides, they need to be confronted and shut down. And when I've tried to do that, it's led to more impasses, right? And that's because there's not enough solidarity on this point, because it's not really negotiable. If you want to have a serious discussion or debate or dialogue or deliberation about politics, the end goal has to be about figuring which side to take in order to move the game forward. And that's without all of the, I think, compromises and appeasements to other sides, right? And I think with a strong, consistent message, it can build a kind of global solidarity that can translate down into local politics. But again, on the kind of intellectual level, we need to stop waffling and running from this issue of partisanship, because it's crystal clear. Why it becomes muddy though is because of the kind of fourth and fifth generational warfare and epistemic warfare that society and individuals and corporations and government wage on ourselves. The world is reflexively dumbed down to the point of not being able to effectively engage in these processes.
What's coming up for you, Bruce?
One, I think in assigning our Fantastic Four identities, I've definitely decided that Brent is the thing. It's clobbering time. He's really good at that. And of course, you have to be Layman, Mr. Fantastic, and stretch into all kinds of domains. I'm thinking about an integrative spirituality as interspiritual of working across boundaries. So interspiritual or metapolitically, ultimately for me, it's a path of love. It's taking the risk of breaking paradigms, of having our own beliefs, illusions, prejudices challenged, and also having our hearts broken, having our spirits really shaken through the refusal to hide out from the world's needs and the world's pain. I think in the service of building a more capacious community and of finding new ways to be together in grace and integrity. It's a love which builds bridges across cultures and traditions, and which also, reinforces them as the situation demands. So I think we have to find a way that even where there are ideological differences or differences in emphasis, if we can, through that, identify deeper common needs and causes, and having some of our own identities challenged in the process of that, I think that's also part of what we need to be up to.
Coming back to Edward's point about how do we mobilize to assist the most, not always the most pure, but the most plausible progressive policy initiative in any given context. That's a huge question, and a whole wisdom of its own has to emerge in order to handle that. And I don't want to downplay that, but I also want to put it next to the questions of who we support, because very often when it comes to politics, we're interested in implementing a certain policy, but we do that through certain people, and they end up dealing with all kinds of things that were not part of what we were thinking about at all. All right, the classic example is you elect a president and he's made a bunch of campaign promises, but as soon as he steps into office, the things he has to deal with it's such an onslaught of surprises that it very often bears very little resemblance to the policy proposals we were discussing. And I think there's a lot of questions around, like abortion is a question like this for me. Is it a question of when should we technically, objectively decide that it counts as a human soul? Or is it a question of who do we trust to make that very hard decision that has no obvious answer, right? Are we going to trust the state, or are we going to trust the mother, or these questions? So I think one of the things we have to do, in addition to figuring out how to get behind policies in various contexts, is to figure out who to get behind in various contexts so that we can trust them to handle things we haven't even thought of yet. So there's an integral friendly but also somewhere along the line, an integrally infused form of politician, diplomat, decider, public servant, civic agent. We need so many of these people, and we should be able to sketch out roughly the skills we need from them. They've got to be multi-dimensional communicators. They've got to be able to make some kind of human connection with a lot of people. They've got to be able to turn their message into something that's mythic and enthusiastic and exciting, around which people can take a stand, and on behalf of which they feel some authentic trust and reliability. And I think maybe there's a role for, Jim Rudd and I have talked a few times about what is it that game B could be better at than game A, right? And so one of the ideas is marketing and consulting might be one of those areas where we might be able to harness our general collective proclivities in these groups to figure out how you actually persuade people and how you actually communicate them in ways that are more effective than traditional modernist political strategy approaches.
Well, we know that our prime example has always been Bernie Sanders. He's been around a long time. He knows the political ins and outs. And he also, during the primary, was leading the way, because his framing was working class issues and working class politics. He was a real progressive populist, as opposed to the authoritarian kind of populism that Trump represented. And there was a lot of crossover in both the Bernie and the Trump demographics, because the issues were populism. Basically, what is good for the working class. So Bernie was excellent at that messaging, and all throughout the beginning parts of the primary was leading considerably. But once again, in taking aside the corporate Democrats, Biden, Clinton, Obama, conspired with all the other people in the primary to give them promises to support Biden. And that turned around in South Carolina, and then Super Tuesday, their spin machine, their propaganda machine, their messaging machine won out, because they know how to manipulate the populace. So again, it's taking the side. We're not just taking the side against Republican authoritarianism. We're taking a side against the Democratic Party neoliberalism. And so the kind of populism that Bernie represented, the messaging was right, it was there, it was having its effect. But part of that is the corporate media machine. They were also not giving him equal time in representation in the news. They were, fluffing up Biden and so on. So media is another aspect of this solution. The progressive media we have is mostly on YouTube and in blogs and so forth. Corporate media is constantly promoting the status quo. And in terms of messaging, that's why I focus my framing and my messaging using Bernie and AOC and the Squad, the Progressive Caucus, as examples of where we make that inroad, to use that kind of inflammatory framing, in their case, in the positive way for the public good, because it has an effect and people respond to it.
Edward made a point about the ill-conceived attempts to import integral theory into the business and political leaders. This is sometimes called third way, of course, and there's still a lobbying firm called Third Way. This zeitgeist hasn't gone away, but it's just as much a part of the false consciousness that I'm talking about. Different types across different interest groups, but false consciousness nonetheless. And the word, well, let me just finish that thought quickly to say, like there is an ultimate way to frame these things, right? It's albeit limited, but capitalism versus socialism, this framing is salient and it's not going to go away just because both of the words are historical words. Okay, this is a kind of end game, if you will, where the socialist meme will continue to envelop our political consciousness to establish these baselines that I'm talking about. There's no way around it. So we need to keep refreshing that point, right? And update how we talk about those respective opposing ideologies, capitalism and socialism. And so when it comes to populism, right, a lot of the commentary was divided over left-wing versus right-wing populism. Like, oh, Trump's a right-wing populist. Now, an economic populist too, to use kind of Steve Bannon's terms. Now, this has been thoroughly debunked by leftist commentators and politicians, right? The right-wing populism is just demagoguery, authoritarianism, austerity. It's none of the good things it claims to be. And so, the word populism is not inherently good or bad, but in the left-wing sense, it can and does lead to progressive policies and foundations that scaffold people up, and then the part of the positive byproduct of that is a more honest political discourse. But there can be reversals, right? So I think a classic example of this is Lula da Silva in Brazil. In the aughts, especially, he was president, and then he was kind of displaced, deposed, if you will, imprisoned by the far right politician Bolsonaro. So, we just need to all be on the same page every day with these types of issues, or else we're just, we're treading water.
Yeah, I want to say a couple of words about these terms and categories for political and economic philosophies. But, first I want to touch back a little bit on this idea of, I guess I've been bringing up a few times, maybe it pertains largely to myself, but the sense of anxiety around identity and anxiety around taking sides. I think one of the solutions to dealing with that, and I'm personally talking to a lot of what I would call younger integral and meta-modern people who very much want to, or tempted to get into politics, and who usually have some kind of employment within corporations that has to do with human resources or messaging or public communication or something like that. And they are, I think, increasingly frustrated about the cautiousness with which people have been approaching things. And maybe it's just coming up through the internet, or maybe it's the sense that time is short and we have nothing to lose, but a kind of deeply held anti-political correctness feeling, like not in terms of the fact that they don't agree with most of the positions that are conventionally called politically correct, but they don't agree with avoiding brawls, not taking risks, not being upsetting to people. Because when you do that, when you get into the game, you have no choice. You have to end up on the side that you're on. When you get into a fight, you take a side, and you end up figuring out that you are on a side, that you're a player in this game. So I think there's too many people in the intellectually balanced, collegial, spirited, meta-discourse communities who've spent their whole lives being able to stay outside of the fray to some degree. And they have to get dirtier in order to figure out where they really are in this game. So the second thing I wanted to say is a little bit about these positions. Our developmental theory when it comes to amber blue is largely that they are symbolically oriented, that a lot of what they think of and speak about in terms of what works in the world is actually what reminds them of things that work in the world. So that they are very susceptible to a person who reminds them of being a businessman, who reminds them of economic populism. And they're being very authentic. Their whole world is structured by reminders. And they go, what are you talking about? Doesn't he remind you of economic populism? It's like, yes, in fact, he does remind me of economic populism. He's just never going to do that. So we have to figure out a way to take that seriously. There are a lot of people who think in terms of reminders, and that's where their thinking stops. When it comes to socialism and capitalism, right, obviously I lean a little more on the socialist side as a Canadian, and I think we're insufficiently socialist in this country, right? It's no surprise that Canada and America are at the bottom of the 11 wealthiest nations in terms of a lot of things they provide, and Canadians just pat ourselves on the back for being slightly better than the Americans in terms of a lot of our quality of life outcomes. So the balance between social security and safety nets and challenge in the world is off base in America. And when I think about modern economies, they're all socialism, capitalism to some degree. They all provide some things to citizens so that citizens can be worker participants, or that entrepreneurial ventures of various kinds can be tried under any name. And they all have some brutal, difficult, competitive aspects to it. So it's not about choosing one over the other, which I think is a false dilemma that the consensus centrist system likes us to get caught in. It's about figuring out what balance of socialism and capitalism is optimal for any given ecological, social, and technological situation. And clearly the one that we've got in North America right now is as a suboptimal balance. So we've got to really bring up how we support people so that they could be competitive players in various kinds of economies.
I just want to respond to that quickly to say that socialism as I'm using it doesn't exclude post-capitalism, right? So that's where we need to get. And also, like I said when I made the point, like it's a limited frame and it requires unpacking, but I'm less talking about economic organization and more talking about political ideology, right? And those can be two completely separate things, but they're related. So, just for example, you could make a corporation like Amazon in the public sector. It could be publicly owned. It's not going to change the operations of Amazon, but it's still going to be ostensibly capitalist because it works in a capitalist world. But the benefits of that company aren't going to be hoarded and disproportionately accrued with Lex Luthor. Sorry, Jeff Bezos. Right. So the point I'm making though is lost on so many people because they think we're talking about the economic, strictly economic sort of means of production. So that everything's socialized. There's no private ownership, and abolition is the end goal. But it's a long road to get there. And in the meantime, we need to at least be intellectually aligned and convergent on an ideal of socialism as an organizing principle of society and politics.
I'd like to ask Bruce more about, he had mentioned, love as a way to cross our boundaries. And to set this up, and perhaps you can respond to it, Bruce, the Pope has just come out with a public service announcement promoting vaccines, and his reasoning is getting the vaccine shows that we care about and love each other. And it's our responsibility to love each other in this time of crisis. So you had mentioned love as that kind of interspiritual, interreligious glue. I'd like you to expand a little bit more on that in light of the Pope, who, us highly evolved people think, oh, well, that's, lower level religion, when in fact, love transcends all those boundaries.
It's interesting the pushback the Pope is getting. I hear in a lot of circles about how he's a deep disappointment to Catholics, but I think he's a deep disappointment to mostly amber or blue Catholics. I want to maybe, in framing that, kind of give a shout out to Michael Schwartz in terms of thinking about where we situate love and how we orient ourselves in this metapolitical space, in an interspiritual space. And he has this idea of the tetracall of the good. He frames it as calls in multiple dimensions of working towards the good for humanity and for the globe. And to me, that's an aspect of love, is working for the good of self and other, right? To identify thriving in conditions of well-being and work to support those things. So for him, the tetracall of the good, he frames it in a couple different ways. In the upper left, integral theories, upper left quadrant, he would say that that's the call towards freedom. And it's freedom in multiple domains. It's freedom from unnecessary constraints and limitations and imbalances that thwart potential. And freedom for the free expression of your being and your potential in the world, to be able to actually actively contribute and express yourself, and basically to pursue the good of yourself and your family and your community without undue resistance or obstruction. And also freedom as, which he would say is just, I think, the freedom to actually be able to cultivate that space where we can rest in our own being, more of a spiritual domain, the Gelassenheit, the freedom to let be. And for the upper right, he would say that that call is towards vitality. And by that, he means the good of the upper right that we're called towards is both power and empowerment of the individual and the community, and health of the individual and community. So there's a whole bunch of things, wrapped up in how we pursue power and health for individuals in balanced and constructive ways. For the lower left, he says that's a call towards responsibility. And here he's thinking about Levinas and Levinas's notion of the other and the ethical charge that a real other confronts us with. For Levinas the other and the relationship, the responsible relationship to other, precedes the we. It precedes the formation of the we. First, we are confronted by another who transcends us, with the being that we cannot ever fully inhabit. Their perspective is unique, and our perspective is unique, and we're not reversible. I can't just say I'm you, you, me in a way that basically erases the integrity of the other individual. So we're confronted ethically by the transcendent other, that then through the formation of relationship and the working out of responsibilities, various kinds of we form. We is not pre-given, we grows out of that ethical confrontation. And then in the lower right, he would say that's the call towards justice, right? And that's the call towards basically a balancing of a meshwork of rights and obligations, rights of individuals and obligations within systems, right? And basically also, you could say those things have to be balanced in some way, realistically, humanely, with the exigencies and demands of the system itself, right? So it needs to be balanced together to find really what, justice for all, right? So to me, to be able to imagine ourselves as, any individual on political and spiritual heroes' journeys, it's to feel those four calls towards I think the realization of deeper thriving in all of those domains, deeper well-being in all those domains. And to me, that's one way of thinking about what love is to work for the freedom of all, the vitality of all, proper responsibility, and balancing of rights and obligations. And for instance, I think one thing that we're experiencing, a lot of tension around in our culture in the COVID times is these different camps who are leaning in the direction of my right, don't dare tell me what to put on or what to do, and the others who are leaning in the direction of your responsibility to the whole. And we haven't worked out that in a way. We need to craft discourses that help us understand that interplay of right and of obligation and right, and possibly situate them in the larger context of the vitality, the responsibility, and the freedom.
I'd like to ask both Layman and Brent. I read both of your articles in the new Metamodern book, and both of you are writing about this theme of, for Brent, it's metanoia, and for Layman, it's some kind of underlying spirit that connects us all. So this is related to the same issue that Bruce was just talking about. So could each of you explain a little bit about your articles in the Metamodern book related to this notion of an underlying spirit, love, or metanoia that we need to bring us all together as a society?
Well, let me just say a couple of things in response to the last few comments, and then maybe Brent can address his article, and maybe I can address mine after that. There's something here about the ethic of love as a participatory ideal, and about these notions of freedom that Bruce is bringing in, and about Brent's notion that we have to not only balance out the need for freedom and the need to value the other, but we also have to privilege one over the other, at least in a current world historical political value sense, because there's an upgrade to socialism that's needed for capitalism to operate properly. Likewise, there's an upgrade in our collective ethic that's needed in order to empower freedom. So we sometimes think about, the value of the collective and the value of the individual as sort of, balancing each other out on two sides. And there's a way in which that's true. But right now, what I think we need is enough general support and organization so that a higher level of individual freedom can begin to flourish. Right now, we have a lot of very low grade freedom sensibilities in our cultures. And I think we need to stabilize and privilege a smart version of a socialist ethic in our politics to provide the platform for an even more intense feeling of freedom to flourish. And I think love is a good way to phrase that, and that love is the internal twin of understanding a network and complexity approach to society more deeply. Because there's this, when you deal with people in terms of vaccines or masks or anything like that, a lot of them are just thinking, is this going to keep me safe or not? Right. And some of them are saying, yes, this is going to keep me safe. And other ones decide it's not going to keep them safe. So it's just bullshit. They're not touching that feeling place in themselves where they're asking the question, is this really going to keep people I care about and everyone safe? And that's the interior emotional twin of learning to think in terms of networks and statistics and complexity, because the way the world actually turns out depends on all these interactions and nodes. You can't figure it out properly, and therefore you can't design policy properly if you're just thinking about, hey, I'm a rational individual and I've shown up and the world is what it appears to be to me in this moment. It's only when we understand these new scientific proposals, essentially, that there's all kinds of epidemic effects and accumulative effects going on constantly in ways that no linear process can really get its mind around. So we have to be thinking externally, what is likely to happen to other people down the line, down the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon when this happens? And also, am I properly feeling enough care and compassion and love and centering the well-being of the others as a higher value even than myself, so that I can achieve more feeling of freedom, but also be a better participant in the system? And then there's one other little piece to that I want to mention, which is Bruce mentioned the confrontation with the real other. And on the one hand, there's a lot of superficial encounters with the other where we don't really get to a place of depth. But also, I think there's a danger in fetishizing this sense that we're going to have a really true, profound, deep relation, maybe one that will transform us. Because I think a lot of the people who are processing the world too slowly to keep up with the changes are waiting for something in their personal life, for their daughter to turn out to be transgender, or for their brother to die from COVID or something. They're waiting for this encounter with a real other before they change. And we have to start understanding that those others are there all the time, whether we've encountered them fully or not, whether they're real to us or not, they're still right there. And that's a difficult thing for a lot of us to grasp, I think, and we need to be a lot better at teaching each other that kind of an ethic. I feel like I've been rambling.
Brent, you disappeared.
Let me say one other thing then that touches this, which is the reverse of what I just said, which is because a lot of people are not very good at appreciating the reality of the other without having had it personally affect them. They also are not very good at receiving political messages based on their care for the other. And so one of the, arguably a limitation to the message meta care for all is the notion of all. If all consists of all of us, then meta care for you, it might reach people more profoundly, even though it implies all. That person checks to see whether they care about everybody. And often you find you don't, or you don't even know enough about everybody to care about them, but you care about yourself. So that there might be a phrasing angle in that going forward. Brent, did you want to give us this sort of overview of the ethical argument of your piece in the anthology?
Yeah. So metanoia is the Greek word for a profound change of mind, literally, more specifically, a conversion. And, you know, I'm very cynical about this publication now because, you know, nothing has changed in my view. You know, and of course, I'm not suggesting that things would magically shift just because of the publication of a book or article, but you know, you'd think it'd at least affect the people involved, you know, the co-authors and contributors of this book, that you know, beyond just touching on it now, that there'd be some sort of centering of this process. And so because that's not happening, I think the easy explanation is that there's still lots of avoidance issues. And to various extents, it does come back to whatever types of psychological blocks or identity issues. But relating it to this point about love, you know, I think we all talk about it. We all advocate for it. I like the term politics of care because it's been used for a while. It's been theorized. And it captures a lot of the practical implications of this sentiment, right? If we fully extend it to the other, to the world, what it means. Yeah, as far as a mass metanoia goes, I think you know, the couple points just raised, two are relevant. The various things that hold us back or misdirect us from that transformation. But at the end of the day, you know, I want to simplify all these things, you know, build on-ramps to them conceptually so that people don't take the wrong road, you know, avoid it further, because it relates to the spiritual just as much as the secular, just as much as the economic. And we need to actualize this love in practice. It can't just be, the kind of host of instantiations that we see, like Deepak Chopra or Eckhart Tolle, talking about in a very wholesome way about spirituality. It can't just be kind of do-gooder mentality, but it needs to be like radically intervening and critical on each other, because we're just going to keep crashing into each other in the world anyways.
Well, I could say a few things about my article, and I think there are definitely some thematic similarities between Brent's piece and mine in terms of a call to a spirit-like metanoia that has political and economic consequences. My piece is partly because I'm doing editorial bookending of the volume, so part of my piece is trying to bring together a lot of the ideas different people had, but my focus is on the interior spiritual work of integration and the exterior interpersonal work of religion. And when I think of religion in terms of an integrative experience, where different classes and categories and types and genres of social activity are brought together, where we stand in the cognitive dissonance between these different modes and perspectives long enough to try to harmonize them, then we have the opportunity to produce an excess harmony, a gestalt effect that was more than the sum of the parts. And the reason I think we need that is because we don't have enough spirit, we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough meaningfulness to mobilize us beyond the status quo in which we are embedded. Most of the problems we're facing as part of the meta crisis, we know pretty good solutions to. So the question is not, can we figure out what to do? The question is, are we willing to do it? How do we get more shared willingness? That's basically a religious phenomenon. Right? It has something in common with movements. It's the interpersonal production of a surplus coherence that people can use to power themselves, to mobilize themselves beyond what they're ordinarily doing. Because ordinarily, everything you're embedded in ends up taking up all of your energy, right? The system balances itself out like predators and prey. In order to change the system, in order to do something that isn't part of everything you're embedded in, you need a little bit extra. Just like we need a little bit extra personally to transfigure our perception into a luminous spiritual experience, or to become a more moral person, or to open ourselves beyond our egoic reactions. You need a little bit of extra energy and meaning to do that. And collectively, we also need to be figuring out how we produce that extra, because if we don't have the fuel in the tank, it doesn't matter if we have the right car or not, is sort of my take.
Since we invoked a few spiritual figures here, like Chopra and Eckhart Tolle, I was thinking about the work that Andrew Harvey is doing. And I think he stands apart. He is generally still in the kind of new age community, but he does stand apart. He's, I think, a different kind of figure, definitely more passionate than either of those. But one of the things that he does is, he frames things in a playfully mythic way, usually drawing from multiple traditions, to enlist kind of greater engagement. So, in our communities, we've been talking about the meta crisis, tasting the pickle, which I do really like Jonathan Rowson's article on tasting the pickle, and to really take that into our being, the bitterness and the complexity, and to swallow that and to digest that. I like that. But we also are kind of talking in an abstract way about the meta crisis and the meaning crisis, and it kind of hovers out there. And one of the ways that Andrew Harvey has been addressing this, maybe some years before this discourse became popular in our communities, is he's been talking about the 7 heads of the beast of apocalypse, or the 7 heads of the dragon of the apocalypse. And he's coming from mostly Buddhist and Hindu background in terms of his own spirituality, but he's using this language to really say there's no place to hide right now. None of us have the privilege to hide out from what's coming and from the looming catastrophes in multiple domains. And each one of them is a dragon head. Or we could also think about it, looking at all the kind of the modern CGI monsters in a lot of our movies these days. They've got the four mouths that are like this way. That's the four quadrants. And this is, we can look at the four quadrants in many ways, but one of them is that the four quadrants represent this multidimensional maw of crises that's coming to confront us and consume us. And how can we mobilize ourselves in response to the seven heads of this beast, or the, the four-pronged maw? And I think we need to find that kind of language and that kind of like mythic resonance to step more embodied and more, I think, grounded in, a sense of heroic and self-sacrificing, self-opening participation in a greater process than just our own self-maintenance and self-care. One thing that he talks about, he has a beautiful book called The Hope, and it made me cry, actually. He had a really beautiful chapter on the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa. And it just made me cry because of the testimony that he shared, coming from, the mouths of some of the, the women who'd had their whole families violated, and confronting the white landowners and things like that. But nevertheless, in that book, one of the things he suggests that I think is worth thinking about is, he says, we need to look at what the terrorists are doing and how effective they are. They have terrorist cells all over the globe that are very good at coordinating and activating themselves and seeding actions, across international boundaries to affect social change under the radar of all the political channels, or at least, under the common political channels. And his suggestion is that we need to build, cells of grace. We need to build these kinds of cells. We can look to the model that they've used and also work towards, in some ways, paradigmatically subversive ends, but grounded in love, grounded in this, greater concern for personal and social metanoia towards, a thriving society. But that, we can take inspiration from that way of working to affect change at a grassroots level underneath all of the typical levers and operators that are so resistant to change so often.
Socialist, pro-terrorist intellectuals with possible ties to diabolical occult practices.
Exactly.
One of the things you brought up there with Harvey was this notion of confronting things not working, right? And in part, that's a huge piece of all progressive intellectual critique of the system that we're embedded in. And in another sense, it's really important for us to try to figure out what is not a viable or plausible route to social improvement for people, right? Part of me is like, hey, we need all options on the table. There's a ton of things now, and what we've been doing is not working. So if somebody's got an experiment or a proposal, it should be on the table. We want to get as many options up there as possible, but we've got to be really sober and clear-eyed about what we've already been doing that doesn't do anything, right? When it comes to climate, me recycling my glass, me not using paper straws or plastic straws, me getting out on the street and telling people my pro-ecology values, these don't seem to have been doing anything. For 50 years, we've been trying these things, and they haven't even slowed down the acceleration of the problem. So whether it's ecology or whether it's the working class, economic stability, general well-being, I think we need to converge around some sense of which options are not on the table. As good as they sound, as nice as they might be for you, as plausible as they might be sometimes, they really aren't accomplishing transformation, and we have to stop expecting that they will.
Well, to directly address that, Hansi Freitag talks about green social liberalism 1.0 and 2.0, and the Nordic ideology of being social liberalism 1.0. And if we define what works in terms of happiness and democracy, the Nordic countries are always in the top 10 in the happiness index and the democracy index. I think that's partly why he uses them as a base from which to launch 2.0. So we have a good model of what seems to work with examples and how they do it, the kind of economy they run, the kind of politics they have, kind of social programs they do. And the closest thing we have to that in America is the Bernie Sanders movement. Now, Michael Moore did a very good documentary, Where to Invade Next. And he goes around to these various countries and asks, well, how do you do things? And he takes, one example from each country. How do you do prisons? How do you do social benefits? And he gets all these examples from all these different countries. And the end of the documentary, he then asks each of them, well, where did you get these ideas? And invariably, each one of those country representatives say, we got them from America during the 50s, or, from the FDR period onward, because we had a green social liberalism, not perfect, but still along those lines in the past in our own country here. And I think that's why I support interjecting, how do we get from here to there? How do we get to our noble vision of 2.0, metamodernism, integral society, is by trying to get us in the US back up to speed on green social liberalism 1.0. And Bernie, the Squad, and the Progressive Caucus, and the policies they propose are exactly, and the values behind the policies, because we go to the different quadrants, the internal idea of the values that support the policies, the policies that support the values, are in that movement. So that's why I support that movement as a way to get from here to there.
Well, I think from the Canadian point of view, it often looks like we're splitting the difference between the advanced European countries and the Americans. And probably the major thing that would liberate Canadian political sensibilities to actually make some progress would be the Americans catching up to the rest of the civilized world, so that when we try to stay slightly ahead of them, we get better up here. Otherwise, in our politics, the example of the Americans is always our excuse to not quite move in the direction of the Nordic countries.
I want to try to add to this by saying, relating it to the concept of social imaginary, because conceivably it's possible to, still have a capitalist state, but completely max out the kind of social welfare and infrastructure and, agency building capacities for citizenry. And I'd say the Scandinavian countries, while being social democracies, they still help perpetuate a global capitalist system. And what I'm saying is it's a long shot, but it historically could be conceivable, as you say, Edward, that these developing countries just copied or took kind of what worked from US models that the US abandoned or gutted, because it's conceivable within a capitalist society, which is very productive, strictly speaking, to have distribution in some sort of equitable, fair, judicious way, and to have, universal healthcare, these sorts of baselines that make a society more robust. So I say all that also to say that, again, to reemphasize the point that we're not, in my mind, we're not striving for some sort of compromise between capitalism and democracy and socialism. We do have to completely socialize some parts of the economy and transcend the capital imperative. And so, other countries can't just replicate the socialist model, the Scandinavian model either. For a variety of reasons. One reason is that was a long-term project, and we're still dealing with a long-term horizon and short-term imperatives. So, we need to continually kind of advance towards a radical ideal that is much better than just, looking at what worked and what didn't work. Because there's some sort of universals and baseline values that underpins all of it in terms of constructing our social imaginary.
The way we imagine economy is something I might like to feel you guys out on, because part of me sees this idea that if we just use a different metric, and if we just divided the spoils of capitalism more intelligently, more fairly, and with a greater eye toward general well-being and future robustness, then we could kind of run the same system that we have now, and it would be all right. But another part of me, and this goes back to the very beginning of this discussion about that gap between higher intellectual discourse and the actual well-being of working people, is the information economy. And I don't mean guys who use computers. I mean the idea that information is somehow the marketable commodity, that intellectual property and copyright and people who trade abstract commodities at high speed are somehow able to operate without producing goods or services. And in the same sense that the intellectual discourse pulls away from the real life of working people, do we feel like it's an inherent problem that the economy pulls away from actual people actually doing things and making things, right? Could we have a great economy that was super abstract, and if we just organize the results properly, we would get the society we want? Or do the symbols and the information universe, does that have to come much closer to real bodies and real objects and real ecologies, and stop drifting away into the idea that we can treat abstractions as objects and pay ourselves for doing that?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is to dive into the question of abstraction itself, right? There's this concept of real abstraction, which refers to all of that real economic activity that underpins the abstraction, the commodity abstraction specifically. But then there's and I think this is a very instrumental discourse, but also the modern monetary theory approach is to kind of undermine the conception of real abstraction and say even that is a kind of construct within capitalism that we need a social imaginary to break through. And I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin, if you will. So, I mean, that's just the starting point, and it's an incredibly complex one to dive into these topics. But I guess in a more appropriate way to address your point, Layman. Yeah, as capitalism evolves, for lack of a better word, it goes into higher abstraction, right? So we have financial abstraction on abstraction, which seems far removed from the labor sort of brute physical force of moving materials around the planet, up to providing services that are the real engine of economics. And so the points you made were kind of what I was getting at about how we account for all of our contributions. And yeah, so capitalism has been incredibly productive, which is why so many of us have the knowledge sector has grown. And so with automation, more and more of us are going to get transferred into the service and knowledge sectors of economic activity. But we just need to remember, and I try to keep this in mind all the time in everything I do, that it's all connected, right? Especially if you pursue it in a way that is self-consistent, right? So if I'm doing intellectual labor, it's to complement the actual manual labor of the world, and then to challenge the capitalist extraction and appropriation of those resources, which are rightly belong to everybody.
I want to bring in Thomas Frank. I mentioned him in our Facebook discussion. He wrote a book a few years back called Listen Liberal, and it's specifically about these issues. That the Democratic Party used to be the party of labor, and then somewhere around Bill Clinton, it got into the promoting the upper classes, particularly Wall Street, and it got into these abstractions, the Wall Street abstractions. And they decided to shift from labor into Wall Street because they had the money and they pay the campaign bills. And that is exactly the issue that Thomas Frank talks about, is that the Wall Street is the prime example of why we crashed. Because these abstractions upon abstractions, these mortgage-backed securities had nothing supporting them from the bottom, actual mortgages. They were creations that were designed to fail so that they could short them out and make a fortune. That's exactly what happened. But it was part of the shift from the Democratic Party into the elitism of the intellectual abstract. And, Clinton had the first Clinton had all these, great social engineering ideas, but they didn't translate down. And in fact, they made things worse in terms of prisons, prison populations, and the economy. And they also partook of the conservative notion of trickle down. If you just feed the rich, everything will come down to us. And we have seen how that has failed. So that's why Frank and many others promote a return to the concrete labor movement as, supporting the working class, once again, giving them negotiating power to, negotiate wages and benefits and safety. All that's been decimated by, the power elite intellectuals. And we have to return to the concrete issues of goods and services and the people that produce them and make them. And while this is also a message to our movements, our integral and our meta-modern movements, which tend to be overly intellectual and want to have top-down solutions. We want to social engineer, here's how you got to do it. But as we've noted in this discussion, these movements also tend to be kind of divorced from the practical application of how to actually do this stuff. And not only that, they tend to look down on it as, oh, well, that's lower level. That's not going to do it. So I can also bring this into a previous discussion we had about real and false reason and the cognitive science of Lakoff, in that real reason is based on the concrete. Our abstractions have to be tied to the concrete examples of, daily life, or else they fly off and they become so abstract they are divorced from that reality. And he calls that false reason. I think we've talked about false consciousness in this discussion. That's a similar idea, that these ideas have to relate all the way back down to pickles. Taste the pickle. What does that taste like? And how does that relate to our notions of, how to help society?
That for me brings up the notion of feedback as a kind of mechanism that keeps us in touch with the world so that our reason tends to be real rather than false. It's sometimes a stretch to try to figure out who the right-wing postmodernists might be, but I make a strong argument for Nassim Taleb, who has a very interesting, kind of conservatively themed critique of how modern systems function. And one of the reasons he thinks that abstract, elite, institutionally promoted modernist intellectuals tend to dominate our economic and political and military discourse is because we mistake insulation from the consequences of our decisions for merit in the meritocracy. If you can run a bank into the ground and walk away with a golden parachute, it looks like you're a winner and therefore should be rewarded in the meritocracy. But what's lacking in that is a mechanism, which is a very natural mechanism in complex systems, to keep people in touch with reality. Right. So that if you've never been to Afghanistan and your children are not in the military and you don't know anyone who's ever died of an opium overdose, then your ability to make a smart, reasonable decision about what to do in Afghanistan interventions is probably very low. And it doesn't depend on how much you care, how much you feel like you want good outcomes, how sympathetic you are to girls who can't go to school, how much you've read and studied about Afghanistan. It comes down to whether you have any skin in the game. Is there anything about this situation you have personal experience of, or is at personal stake for you in making this decision? And that activates a different layer of our intelligence and psyche that keys us into reality. And if we don't have that, all kinds of well-meaning, very plausible sounding, very well-informed theories can come forward, and it's highly probable that they will crash this ship because we're not using the intelligence that ties reason to reality.
I like to use pair concepts from Timothy Morton and Derek Jensen. Very different fellows, but Derek Jensen talks about the silencing, and Timothy Morton talks about the severing in his recent book called Humankind, on building an ecologically grounded and aware Marxism. But for Derek Jensen, the silencing points in multiple directions. It points at how civilization has tended to proceed and develop through this process of distancing ourselves from felt relation and felt impact. Actually, that distancing helps amass power. And there's a whole dynamic at play in terms of how we are able to basically exert will over the environment, exert will over certain peoples, exert will over whole nations and populations. And a lot of it has been through this creative use of distancing ourselves from the felt relationship and connection to the object on which we are acting. And he gives a lot of examples of basically of, silencing of women, silencing of minorities, silencing of animals in terms of having any real voice, any interiority. The more that we keep them at a distance, we don't have to think about the feeling, relationship, and responsibility to them, and we're able to basically be empowered to act on those things in ways that people who are remaining connected wouldn't broach because of the immediate felt impact of that action. And he traces out this evolution of the distancing of ourselves from the effects of our actions toward now, the apotheosis of that is, being able to put your finger on a button and wipe out a continent, right? And there's no there's no connection there. Bringing in a personal story, this is probably morbid to bring it in, but as a little boy, I had some kittens and I wanted to protect them against fleas, and I poured way too much flea powder all over them, and it began to poison them. And I watched them dying right there and in great torment. And my mom told me I needed to go kill them, put them out of their misery. And I didn't know how to do it. I couldn't bring myself to actually, even though I had already killed them by basically putting the powder on them, how could I do that next step of actually putting them out of the misery? I went and I thought the easiest way for me to do that is to throw them in a lake. I went and I threw them in a lake, and I thought, okay, that'll be the end of them. They'll find some relief from this effects of the slow poisoning. I watched them struggle in the water, and it was terrible to watch. So I finally went out and had to push some underwater, and the feeling of that little creature struggling so mightily to hold on to life against, the weight of my hand in the water was such a horrible, deeply impactful feeling of just taking this little life and how much energy it poured into saving itself. That deeply impacted me in terms of my sense of relationship to living beings and responsibility towards things. But society basically builds by, creating bigger and bigger spheres of insulation. And, that's allowed us to move in certain directions. And of course, Derek Jensen is a little bit of a radical, and he's questioning the whole civilizational project. So we maybe don't need to go that far, but he says if you do follow the logic of our present civilization, it is built on that. It's not incidental to that. It's built on that. And how do we deal with that? And similarly, Morton is talking about how basically we live in what he calls the symbiotic real. We are multiple beings that are inhabited by multiple beings and microbes and organisms, and we depend radically for our survival on the well-being and the continuation of all kinds of beings in the world. And there's a natural pre-given, he would say, biological solidarity that we maintain with this larger living web that's essential to continuing as a species. And, he says basically the severing is the act of forgetting that connection, the act of forgetting our solidarity with the larger living earth. And how do we recapture that? And so I think that's related to what you were talking about, building the right kind of feedback loops that allow us to plug in to the world, in a deeper way, and to feel what's going on in the world and to see the results of our actions and our policies and our positions in a visceral way. It makes me think of Joanna Macy with her grief work and her work that reconnects. And she's been all over the globe, just asking people to go through various exercises, but basically to sit with our condition and to allow the actual feelings and the pain and the confusion to arise in the individual in order to basically reopen feedback loops that we've closed through conditioning by societies that function by keeping large sections of the world behind barriers in zones of no feeling or no consequence, right?
Yeah, and how in terms of realities, how different that experience of having to kill those kittens you've already poisoned is from the abstractly similar university class being guided through the trolley experiment about whether they would or would not push a person in front of a train. There's a real lack of reality in our educational procedures, which is partly because educational facilities are impinged upon by parents and societies that they don't want to upset. and by the sense that the parents are a customer base who you want to provide a service for, and in which case you want kids to be safe and not really take risks and not really be upset because you're trying to please the customer. But if you really wanted to educate people in reality, we're not necessarily talking about having every kid go out and kill kittens necessarily, but they have to be able to take risks and try moral experiments to figure out what their integrity is in order to show up in the world as beings with integrity. And that's very different than just, doing a few mental games about what your values would or would not make you do in a given circumstance. So we've got to get way more real about moral education. Brent, did you want to come in here?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of good points there. And I liked everything Bruce was trying to consolidate there with those two thinkers. Jensen's idea of distance. I'm a bit familiar with him, but not that particular idea from him. And that's interesting because I've thought a lot about this in terms of the division of labor. And actually somewhere in Durkheim or somebody, I have a source that kind of unpacks the social abstraction of the division of labor. And it speaks to what you were getting at, Bruce, about how, we become further and further kind of isolated from reality. And it actually correlates with the increasing abstraction of society, like the increasing abstraction of, and complexity of our social imaginary means we're all further differentiated in our roles and our identities, and that separates us from that connection with the sort of interbeing that is the really constant extant reality behind it all. And yeah, the trolley car problem is deeply flawed, right? For it to be such a staple of modern education, I think is precisely because it just kind of gives an illusion of order and simple choice. It's not a thought experiment because it gets you to think critically. It's a thought experiment because it gets you to think in a kind of deterministic way consistent with the order of society. Right. So one of my favorite things is looking at trolley car memes, which just disrupt the status quo of that teaching tool. And when you see the memes, when you see the differentiation of types of this thought experiment that just blow away the false choice, it sort of breaks you free of that matrix and from that separation of each other and with reality itself, with nature or whatever we want to call it.
So I'm still wondering, how do we, us right here, inculcate the kind of spirit or love or metanoia or transformational personal experience? How do we get that? How do we make working class feel that? I've suggested that, like a Bernie Sanders speech, in effect, sort of does that, because his framing and his speech patterns and talking to the injustice of, the economic system, I know that elicits in me personally and people that I've been in groups of who have watched his speeches, we do feel that sort of group transformational process where we go, yes, that's what we need. That's who we must support. So is it just, do we just need to support those kinds of leaders who give us that kind of experience? What are other examples? What do we do?
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. I mean, obviously we need to move behind good policies, which are simple enough and universal enough and solve a lot of problems all at once and work in a complementary fashion with each other. We obviously need to get behind people that we think can see how to do that, how to bring it into manifestation, and who we personally think have a lot of integrity and charisma. We also need to think about how we communicate broadly. And one of the things that's come up for me a number of times, I don't know how realistic it is or not, but it stands out in my heart, which is modernity, orange, the neoliberal centrism with two wings, has such a behavioral hold on the whole planet. It's such a ferocious adversary that I don't think progressives or traditionalists can do it on their own. And when they play back and forth against each other, they just get co-opted by the centrist style. So there has to be a way for the energy of amber blue to work with the systemic insights of green in order to get a mass that's powerful enough and connects the higher ideas with the reality of working people who are often marginal members of modernity, and to get that all together. And I think there's an ethos waiting to be tapped. Right. My girlfriend said when Sanders was running, and we were both supporting him for the nomination, but she said, why isn't it called American socialism? And when I thought about that, I thought of it underlined. I thought, because there's people who think symbolically, and they need to see that there's a symbolic emphasis. And there's other people who think systemically, and they need to see that it's the right policy. You've got to bring the right policy together with the symbolic emphasis of the people who are not policy people, right? Maybe it's not about Medicare for all. Maybe it's about Medicare for you. Maybe it's not about ecology is important. Maybe it's about our country's nature is the best and most important nature in the world, and I'm willing to sacrifice myself for our land, or something like that. That there's a symbolic spirit that needs to be tapped in combination with progressive proposals for policy. And if you don't have both, it's unlikely we'll have enough allies to challenge modernity's entrenched power structure and its highly adaptive manipulation and undermining machinery.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was just thinking that in response to something that Edward shared in terms of, the appeal of AOC and the squad and Bernie. And I think for people in our circles, there's a lot there that we value and can see, strengths in. But I'm also in enough circles, especially in my family in Texas and other places, where I know that the way that they speak is not landing, especially from the squad. Even though it might be what they're talking about in the best interests of a lot of people who are hearing it, they're rejecting it because of the way it comes across and the way it's presented. And I think we need to find that ethos that can actually speak to the sensibilities that you're naming there, and with the right symbolic language that can enlist participation that isn't happening right now. In fact, it's automatic knee-jerk dismissal and reaction in huge swaths of people. And that's really unfortunate.
I think we also need to be looking for who we think would be effective, which also means charismatic champions and representatives of the kind of policies we want. And they're not always the same as the people that we see take a very smart and principled stand for these policies. Right. In some cases, obviously Bernie's become an increasingly charismatic figure over the years, and he's been uniquely able to bring forward a lot of these things. I think Cornel West has done a tremendous job, right? He's an authentic religious figure in the sense that I mean religion in terms that he viscerally brings together and blends and embodies so many different genres of cultural engagement that there's a moral overflowing from his being such that he seems as much a saint as he is an academic. There's also people like Joe Rogan, who, there's a lot of legitimate progressive critique for some of those things, but by and large, his social vision is in agreement with most of Sanders' proposals, and he can gain the support of people who are not in that ethos at all. People who are put off by what they think is the agitating speaking style, the wrong rhetoric, the disturbing sociopolitical woke polarization that they either see something fishy about or don't know how to get behind. There's a whole bunch of people, and we need them, and they have to be brought together in terms of these baseline policy agenda items. But that's very often going to take somebody who isn't the person we think is the best, most moral articulator of that. It's somebody who can span both of those worlds and has to be in play. Right? I know that a lot of institutional centrist movements were made against Bernie's campaign, but at the same time, if it had been Sanders Rogan, that would have been a lot more difficult for Clintons and Obamas to dislodge, because it would have drawn from this other support system, which is also full of working class people.
Yeah, I think this sort of thing is the tipping point that we need to keep pushing towards, and it will be a tipping point, or else, like, why do anything? Right? Why are we bothering if we don't believe in waves and cycles that iterate and progress? And especially in this end times, as it were, like this is the last chance. So, and I need to stipulate, it should be obvious to us, but for whoever's still unsure about this, like the left vanguard that was pushing Bernie was always clear that, there would be challenges to his power in the White House, and that some of his policies didn't go far enough. Right. So my principles have been consistent. And like a lot of Bernie supporters, Bernie and the movement was the first, not just legitimate voice of this movement, because there has been many in the past, but it was the first, like, large swell that approached these tipping points. And so, and Bernie always said it's not about him, right? And so there's this abstraction beyond the figurehead of Bernie that is inevitably the tipping point that we have to keep pushing for. And so I maintain that, having a Clinton or a Biden presidency, or of course a Trump presidency, these are all extremely suboptimal outcomes. And yes, a Bernie presidency would face lots of challenges, but we're at this threshold with climate change and with the internet, or not threshold, but we're in this time between worlds, if you will, right? Because it's being stretched out over decades. There's no turning back, right? So the politics we're trying to instantiate, of course, goes beyond the whole political matrix of identities and interests, but it is unequivocally, unabashedly, from the leftist tradition, from the socialist tradition, and in many cases, like you say, American socialism. There's a rich tradition of socialism in America that's sort of written out of the history and silenced, if you will, made invisible, as Bruce was touching on. So, this is what we need to have consensus on already going into the next elections, right? Globally, right? We have to have a concern and an attention span for global elections, all across scales, right? From local municipalities to, who is the head of the UN, or any of the sub bodies of the UN, or who are the major actors in the military industrial complex who are helping it to turn, helping it to transform into a peace industrial complex. We need to just keep refining the resolution of that social imaginary, and then, for lack of a better word, sell it to people. People want to be political consumers. They want to be sold a fantasy, whether it's Trump or Biden. We have to, kind of trick people into voting for the greater good and the best interests for everybody individually and for the planet.
Politics is something I'm very ambivalent about, right? Part of me is very turned on by it, very tuned into it. Constantly, my brain generates new political insight patternings. At the same time, I have this deep cynicism that there's anything of value there or that any change can be made. Bruce was talking earlier about the fact that, we also have to think about politics outside of elections and things like that, because there's a strong chance that maybe nothing goes through in this given system, the way it's set up. But nonetheless, when we look at the current situation and we see how much quote unquote polarization is at play, or how much people's political worldviews are taking the place of what used to be religious dogmatisms and religious conflicts in our culture, we might be thinking about politics as the privileged religious battleground of at least the mid 21st century. And to the degree that we are interested in philosophy and transformation and change and religious themes, as I deeply am, I have to take that seriously and think that, yeah, there's a lot of failure. Maybe politics doesn't go anywhere, but on the other hand, maybe it's becoming the only game in town. It's the place where every other aspect of our lives are going to converge. And so we do need to take that seriously and not feel that classic intellectual's anxiety about being on one of the political teams.
We've been at this over 2 hours. I mean, do we want to keep going or what?
I was just about to say that also. I think we're probably at a good point for a single video. And, it does seem like there's a lot still to explore here. So we can possibly look forward to Fantastic Four Quadrants number 2 or going forward. So, yeah, I'd like to ask, too, if there's anything that anybody would like to share kind of in wrapping up of what we've been covering today. I would say from my side, one topic I didn't talk about in as much detail as I wanted was on the idea of sacred activism. I'm looking at things like what Velcro Ripper does with his scared sacred or fierce light, or those kinds of perspectives, which are really looking at, putting yourself on the line for, social transformation, activism for social transformation that maybe isn't doing what we always do of walking the picket line and things like that, but some additional steps, creative steps that we really need to make both internally and externally to be effective change agents. So I would say I'm going to leave that out for now, and maybe in a follow-up video discussion, I'll kind of get into some of those ideas.
Yeah, there's a lot of ideas I'd still like to get to, but at the same time, there's also a sense of digging, right? That it's beyond the ideas we want to bring forward. There's something we're all chewing into, and I feel like we've made some progress, but I just feel viscerally how much more there is to get through in order to achieve clarity and convergence. But I'm pleased that we've done this. I'd like to do more. I'd like to do another one. I think we have a lot of positions in common, and so we probably have a lot of shared feelings. And I'd like to make that even more explicit and obvious and have that feedback into our faces in a way that can energize us and clarify us. And even though I was always more of a DC guy, maybe you could throw up some versions of those Fantastic Four characters when you come to the editing process, Bruce.
I'm going to.
Well, speaking of the Fantastic Four and the Marvel universe, as opposed to the DC universe, I just had a discussion with someone about how I started to watch the new Suicide Squad movie, and I couldn't get past an hour. I mean, I struggled through the first hour, and I said, I give up. And I said, mainly because the characters have no redeeming value, and they are kind of like comic book characters of, evil. Now, granted, all of these superhero movies are comic book characters that kind of separate the good from the evil, the heroes from the bad guys. But in the Marvel universe, they really seem to get into the character, the depth of the characters, as opposed to just being cardboard cutouts. And to me, that was someone brought that up and said that's what they see as the difference between the Marvel and the DC universe. Now, that's not completely correct, because some of the later Batman movies really got into the depth of, Batman's story and his good and bad sides, and made more of a character. And also the Joker movie got really into the psychology of the Joker. So it's not a complete generalization, but there is some truth to that.
Yeah. I would say that when DC is done well, as it was with the Dark Knight, as it was with the Joker, it brings forward the ideological architecture of the society more profoundly than Marvel usually does. But the average Marvel production is more enjoyable and more character driven than the average DC production, for sure.
Maybe I'll just give a closing thought here if we're wrapping up. There's lots I can say about the whole superhero genre. I think it's very interesting and entertaining, and actually serves an important function in trying to transform our social imaginary. But a couple sort of broader points related to our whole discussion. One is the idea of freedom, like how we conceptualize and differentiate that, like is having financial freedom and buying like a fancy car or a yacht that takes you places, or being able to travel. Like, is that really freedom, right? Because it's part of the capitalist social imaginary, right? That diverts our attention away from the struggles of life into escapism. And so, it's a double-edged sword, because movies can be escapist and movies can be misinterpreted. Famously, the right wing hijacked the Matrix metaphor of the red pill, right? They just didn't get it. And they refused to get it. And so that relates back to a final point, which is something I said earlier, which is, right-wing economic populism isn't a real thing. If it wants to get serious about it, then, maybe we'd have a more legitimate political contest. But, when I talk about tipping points and paradigm shifts, and they can happen, right? It's my understanding that the Green Party is gaining a lot of steam in Germany, right? So this kind of thing is unheard of typically. Most Green parties, have like single digit percentage points of the electorate. And what we need is such a dramatic shift in consciousness that some of these parties actually collapse, right? The Republican Party has gutted its base and dumbed down its base, so it deserves to collapse. So why are we continuing to prop it up, right? So I think it's related to this problem collectively of just continually kicking the can down the road. Oh, voters are good people, or whatever. I think we need to get real with each other and be able to confront those differences and overcome them. Because at the end of the day, a lot of political energy is captured and funneled right back into capitalism. And then that recreates the socialist imaginary, right? That Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, that we're all stuck in. So that's real freedom, right? And obviously everybody needs a certain level of material well-being, and financial ability. But real freedom is having some sort of purpose with your life that is not just being fed back into the system, right? So, cargo cults are a good example of when people believe in something and it gets proven wrong, but instead of changing, they double down on their belief. They double down. So we're seeing that entrenchment, that doubling down almost everywhere, right? Republicans, Democrats just don't want to change. But that, it's going to hit the United States like a tsunami. And it's because it's been building towards that. So I just want to continually attempt, in my limited capacity, to give voice to that, to articulate what's happening, what needs to happen, and how we can actually build a broader coalition to work together on that.
Thanks everybody for being here, and I look forward to us doing this again. And I hope that what we're talking about and working on has some kind of effect. I also hope that I want to wish good luck to all of us in terms of all the real challenges we're also each facing in our own lives.
Thank you. Enjoyed this conversation with all of you.
Likewise.
Amen. Glory be unto God.
Excelsior.